Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy. So one of the things, Derek, that I see coming into my practice is different reasons for getting sober or getting help. And one of the main ones is starting the process for someone else, or someone else approach them. Someone else is motivated for their change, whether it's a spouse, a family member, a boss, a colleague. And so they're starting their process to kind of appease someone else. Is that something you're seeing too? And how do you start from that place?
Absolutely. I think what happens is that generally we will continue some behaviors, whatever that is, whether it's using substances or whatever that is, we'll continue those behaviors until something gets in the way. If things are going well, if your job is going well and your relationships are going well and your health is fine, then it's usually not an indicator that there's anything you need to take a closer look at. And much of the time, it's people who kind of notice something or have concerns about something and then start applying a little bit of pressure to address that issue. So I think that, I would say a majority of the time when somebody first begins the process of looking at their kind of compulsive behaviors and things that are causing some issues in their life, it typically will come from someone else. It'll come from a partner, from a family member, it'll come from a friend, it'll come from a colleague at work. And so there's kind of a balance in that as far as kind of the initial reaction typically is to push back a little bit. But for many people, when they start the process, it's based on the fact that they're really not doing it for themselves. They are doing it to try to appease someone else or to try to kind of strengthen a different relationship. So that I think that can be confusing, particularly because, one of the main messages people get is you have to do it for yourself.
Yeah. And I also think it's also confusing because it's someone else's opinion about what is right or wrong. So if someone approaches their spouse and says, I think you have a problem with this, they're not living that life. They have actually no idea whether or not it's a problem for them. They have their own struggle with how it's playing out. Yeah. And so I think it's almost kind of like two separate issues happening. One is whether or not there is kind of overuse or some kind of behavior that's gotten out of control. And the other is how a person feels about it.
Absolutely. And one of the questions I ask people early on when I'm working to assess what the situation is are there other people in your life that are concerned about your behaviors? And typically, you're right, it can be isolated to one person, that one person has an opinion of that or an assessment of that. And then, I think when those numbers go up to 2 or 3 or 4 people in your life, then it's usually a very good indicator to at least take a look at it. And I think that's the challenge. That's what we hope people will do is it's not so much to just off the bat assess kind of how big of an issue this is, but it's really like kind of I like to tell people to come in from a place of curiosity and be willing to ask questions and be honest with yourself about how much is this impacting your life. And the thing for a lot of people, if they are kind of deep into it, one of the things, because there's been typically a lot of dishonesty around their behaviors, that we start to lose the ability to be honest with ourselves. So when you're asking somebody to be curious and honest, we may think we're being honest with ourselves, but we're not even sure what that looks like anymore.
Yeah. I guess also one of the interesting things that happens that I see is that, fast forward 6 months, fast forward a year, you've been actively pursuing recovery and now you feel better, right? It's like, okay, so I gave a break to this. So it's not an issue anymore. So I'm going to start doing it again. So that over the course of that time, there wasn't a deeper belief of I have a problem and I can never do this again. It's, oh yeah, I kind of got my life back and now, I can do this again. And that's kind of an interesting thing to navigate, as well as maybe that relationship ends. You leave that job where they were really concerned about your use, or the relationship ends and you're no longer kind of on this path because of that person. And so now it's like you kind of have to kind of navigate, how do I want to do this now that those external motivators are no longer around in the same way?
Yeah, I think that when people are beginning this conversation with me, one of the questions I ask them is, looking at these kind of four key areas of your life to see if those behaviors have impacted that. And I think that many times people focus on the first three, but I think the fourth one is actually the most important. But the questions you kind of ask are, let's say we're discussing alcohol, like, is it affecting any relationships in my life? Is it affecting what I do all day, every day? Meaning, if you have a job or if you're in school or whatever your, in quotes, job is at that time in your life, does it affect your health? So it's kind of relationships, day to day operations, health. And then the fourth one, which I think is now being talked about more, but I think historically has not been talked about enough, is how does that affect your self esteem? How does it affect about how you feel about yourself? Because I think ultimately, as people get into this and start doing some work, they recognize that that's the area that probably was damaged the most, is kind of how we view ourselves. And some of that goes along with the behavior. Many times there's hiding and being dishonest about kind of some of the things we're doing, which usually starts around the thing, in this case, alcohol, but then starts to spread into other areas. And, I think innately, if we're living life somewhat dishonestly, that's a surefire way to affect your self esteem.
Yeah. So that's a lot, right? So now someone's coming in because their spouse or someone is saying, "Hey, I want you to look at your alcohol use." And now you're talking about all these other factors, which could be a challenging thing for somebody because they're there because they want to save a marriage or they want to stay in their job or they don't want their kid to disengage from a relationship with them. And now they have all this other stuff to think about, which, I guess is the benefit of being in therapy, right? It's not just about the thing, alcohol, drugs, sex, gaming, whatever it is. It's kind of about you as a person and navigating what are kind of healthy choices and a healthy path forward.
Well, I think that, like I mentioned earlier, one of the messages that people get is that you have to do this for yourself. And so they're somewhat confused because they will say, well, I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it to save my marriage or my job. And I think they feel like they're doing something wrong. I always tell them, whatever the motivator is to start you on that process, because my hope is that if you have something that motivates you, let's say you're trying to save a marriage and that allows you to start some sobriety and some recovery, what I know is that the odds are very high that your life is going to improve. If there's a significant issue there, your life will start to improve. And so in the beginning, you may be doing it for other reasons. But I think once you have a chance to get a little time under your belt and a little reflection, then it becomes more obvious to the person themselves that, hey, wait a minute, my life is getting better and things are improving. So maybe there is something to this. Maybe there is something to continuing on this path. If I'm on an upward slope, then maybe it's worthwhile to kind of continue to look at it. And so a lot of times you see people transition from starting for doing it for someone else or for some other reason. But once they're able to kind of get some experience and able to reflect a little bit, then that kind of shifts and they kind of naturally starts to become more for themselves, even though they were originally motivated by some other factor.
Yeah. What do you do when somebody changes their mind, right? Somebody says, "Hey, look, I've done this for 6 months or a year. I'm quote unquote, I'm better. I can do this differently, right? I can re engage in this activity in a different way." How do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always very honest with people, and I think the thing that has benefited me personally is that over the last 20 years, I've watched a lot of people go through this, and I've watched a lot of people try, and I personally have not seen somebody who, and again, we'll focus it on substance abuse for this, but somebody who had had a substance abuse issue that was impacting their life. I haven't seen people go back and use that substance differently or even a different substance. And so I think, what I do is I'm honest with them. I say, like, look, this is your deal and you get to make decisions on your own life. And if you want to try to work through that, I'll be supportive of the things you want to do and you want to try. But I'm very honest and I say, my experience has been that I haven't seen that end very well and your life has gotten significantly better over the last 6 to 9 months. I don't want you to have to go through some, further turmoil to see that. But there are people who feel like they want to do that and do need to do that. And statistically and anecdotally, it just doesn't typically turn out very well. And so you see some kind of uninvited pain coming back into their life. But everybody has their own experience and it's individualized. You can't really generalize with any of this. But, if I just look at anecdotally the experience that I've seen, the odds are not in their favor.
Right. Well, and what do you think is happening in someone's mind that says, I've gone through the pain, I have gone through some of the changes, I'm not doing it for this person anymore. I want to live my life for me and my decision. What do you think comes back from a psychology perspective, a mentality perspective, where it's kind of reintroducing something that was so associated with pain?
I mean, I think it's a chicken and an egg. And I think that, many times people think that the reason why they ended up where they did is because they were unhappy or their life wasn't going well or they were in a troubled marriage, that these are the reasons that they were using in the first place, that my life wasn't going well. And so I ended up using substances to an excess or other behaviors and don't necessarily consider the flip side of it, that the driver of some of those things was impacted by the substance. And so I think it's my life has gotten better, things are improving. The only reason why I had a problem in the first place is because life was not good. And so now life is good. So I should be able to go back and just do this normally or socially or whatever that is. I think that the question I always ask people, and again, I'll be specific, I guess, to alcohol here, but the question isn't always whether you can drink normally. It's being honest with yourself and asking if that's even what you want. Do you really want to drink normally? Like, do you want to go out and have one glass of wine with dinner? For the most part, the people that I work with, if they're able to be honest with themselves, that's not really what they want. What they really want is they want to drink the way they want to drink without the consequences. And unfortunately, we can't hide from those.
Yeah. And so on the flip side of that, what is the psychology? What is the mental shift to move beyond that? You recognize the change, you feel better. Maybe you're still in that same relationship, maybe you're not. So what is the new thought process that is happening where, we disengage from the idea that we want to go back to a healthier version of use? Because I heard this a long time ago, that alcohol is the only drug that we have to convince people why we don't use it. You don't ever sit around with a bunch of people and say, oh yeah, I don't use this drug because, I mean, normally we're not doing that. Whereas with alcohol, there's so much kind of normalized use in our society that if you don't use it, then you almost have to convince or prove people why that's okay. But what helps somebody get to be okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do when I'm working with people is, and I didn't come up with this, but is to really work on reflection and kind of constant self awareness and even assessment of how your life is going. And so I'm somebody who sometimes thinks in numbers, and many times I will ask people, when we first started talking on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 is you've got the greatest life of anybody you know, and 1 is your life is horrible, what was it? And, typically the answers are it's a 2, it's a 3, it's a 4, sometimes it's a 1. It's not often a 9 or a 10. And then as they've had some time in recovery, that kind of number is going up. Their life is getting better. And through reflection, we can kind of track that and see that and be aware of that. And so what I hope for when I'm working with somebody and want them to see them have a better life is that, when I met you 6 months ago, life was a 2. The biggest change you made in your life over those last 6 months is you removed substances from your life. And now when I ask you what life is, you say it's a 7. So I understand that you may not necessarily believe that the X factor there was the substances, but are you willing to risk that? And, lots of times people say, well, it's just not that important to me. Alcohol is not that important to me, so I think I could drink normally. And my question is, well, okay, so let's say that's true. If it's not even that important to you, why would you risk going back to a 2 if life is now a 7? One of the things I say to people a lot is staying sober is much easier than getting sober. And so you've already done the hardest part of this journey. You're now seeing the payoff from it. And why would you risk having to go through that again, especially if something's not really that important to you?
Yeah. And I guess what I check in with people about from my perspective is, how often are these thoughts coming up, right? Is it one every 10 days? Is it once a month? Because whatever frequency that is, if you just kind of get through that moment, whether it's a dinner or a holiday or whatever it is, most likely you'll wake up the next day and kind of probably be glad that you didn't do that. But it's more of those are the reminders that come up of, can I do this in a different way? And so what I try to check in with people on is, how often is this coming up and how much does it really kind of impact your day to day, and kind of how to ultimately navigate the percentage breakdown, right? I mean, if this is happening only a couple percent of your day to day life, that those are probably easier to get past. And if it's coming up more and more, really digging in, like you said, around the self reflection is, why do you think it's coming back the way that it is? And what do you think that's there for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that ultimately, I would say the majority of people, a high majority of people who find a life in recovery, that that's a better way for them to live. And, I think that as human beings, that's what we're all doing. I think we're all trying to find the best life we possibly can. And on that rating of 1 to 10, we're constantly doing things to try to move that up in our understanding of our own lives. And so if we find something like this, to your point, that you're thinking about 3% of the time, and without that, you're able to continue that line moving up slowly or quickly, then people find that it's definitely worth it.